welcome into another episode of Everything is Logistics, a podcast for the thinkers in freight. I am your host, Blythe Milliken, and we are proudly sponsored by SPI Logistics. And we've got one more, our last interview at Manifest, the future of supply chain and logistics, at least the last live one. And we've got a repeat company, not repeat guest, but a repeat company coming back on the show. We got Jonathan Ryan, Overhaul's Chief Product Technology Officer, to talk about the state of cargo crime for 2025, along with a new a product that you guys are launching here. Is the press release dropped today?
I don't believe it dropped today. I think it dropped it a little while ago, but I'm going to talk more about it.
Gotcha, and that is your new Fraud Watch AI solution, the $55 million in funding that they announced previously, as well as broader trends happening in supply chain risk management and cargo risk theft prevention space. So that was a mouthful for myself. So I'm going to let the expert take over from here. And Jonathan, give us a preview, give us an overview of how you got into logistics, how you got into working for Overhaul, all that good stuff.
Yep. So unfortunately, I don't have a 20-year story to tell you about how I got into supply chain logistics, but I completed a computer science degree in Ireland. I'm from Ireland, and worked in finance for a year in Ireland. Really wanted to go to the US and explore more on the technology side and get into something there. And I kind of expected after a year in the US, I'd return to Ireland and have to find a new company, but come back with some experience. But I found Overhaul, and I started working in the product and kind of tech support space 8 years ago, almost 9 years ago now. And one of the lucky things about that, I guess, is it meant wearing a lot of hats. And as we kind of pivoted into the SaaS solution that we have today, I moved more into the product space, engineering space. And over the years then, as we found that product market fit, moved into engineering management, VP of engineering, and then a year and a half ago, we consolidated the product and engineering orgs into technology, and then I moved into the CPTO role.
And so with your role with Overhaul, what does sort of a day-to-day look like for you?
There is no one single day for sure, but we have a global team, engineers and product managers, so a lot of what I try to do is just make sure that everybody's on the same page around what we want to achieve, what are some of the challenges we're facing. What I really like to try and incorporate into all of our technology teams is good industry understanding. I think it's really important that whether you're an engineer or a product manager, you understand the space and you know why you're solving the problem. And so it's a lot of that coordination. And then also just working with our sales, marketing, that go-to-market strategy, things like that, and are really just pretty broad still. I think we're coming out of that startup phase, and we've been out for a while, but as someone who joined the company fairly early, you still kind of wear quite a few hats and try to tackle quite a few problems.
So from a high level, what does sort of risk and fraud prevention look like in the modern day 2025 logistics company?
Yeah, and I mean that's the first question everybody asks is, what does risk mean to you? And so, our software is risk management solution across a variety of different risks. So the risk might be on-time performance, ETAs, and the risk that means to your customers not arriving on time and how it can affect your relationship. But more traditionally, what we focus on is security and risk. And so what that means is the actual integrity of the goods and the load, and also the safety of the driver as part of that as well. And so what we set out to achieve is, first and foremost, be preventative. You don't want stolen goods. You don't want pilferages that you're having to respond to. So we try to, through incorporation of our technology, improve our customers' supply chains by bringing in best-in-class processes, procedures, trying not to overwhelm. I think it's important that you're able to keep very close to the procedures and processes they follow today, but incorporate technology in the right places so that you can get that data back and help continually monitor and improve their network.
You had just mentioned, sort of the safety of the driver, which is, I think I haven't really heard any other sort of risk prevention, fraud prevention company talk about. Can you expand on that a little more?
Yeah, I mean, in the early days before we kind of pivoted into the SaaS solution, that was something that we were very focused on, was how can we help the drivers, carriers, find these higher value shipments and loads, and somebody who's been performing, at a very high level for years, but maybe struggling to get into that continual reoccurring operations. And so as part of that driver focus, we wanted to ensure that there was safety from their perspective as well, particularly when you're operating globally in some of these more dynamic environments where there can be, concerns around that. I think that's as important as ensuring the cargo,
When I had a previous guest from Overhaul on the show, we were talking before we recorded that they had mentioned all of I guess the differences between countries of Brazil versus Mexico versus the United States, of how they try to try to implement fraud prevention, risk management, things like that.
Yeah.
I'm curious how that's evolved. What is sort of, I guess, a high level process look like? Because you mentioned that some of those things that are happening in other countries are now coming to the United States.
hmm Yeah, and so maybe to even take a step back a little bit and speak to what Overhaul does. So we are a software company, and we look at integrating all of the various data that already exists out there. And so we're not hardware, we don't build devices, but we do integrate with them, and we are device and IoT agnostic. And so what that allows us to do via maybe TMS, ERP, WMS, OMS integrations is create that customer shipment. And then via our telematics, ELD, IoT integrations, populate that shipment with those data sources and those pings that allow us to track a shipment. And so what that does from the security perspective then, and maybe getting into what we see across different regions, that provides a higher level of visibility and a higher frequency and a higher resolution network. And so when it comes to cargo theft, what we've typically seen in areas like, or regions like Mexico, Brazil, is a lot more risk to the driver in those areas. And it can be, I'm not sure what the right word to put on it is, but an environment where the driver is definitely a little more aware of the issues they might encounter while on the road. But what we've seen over the last couple of years is a lot of those methods that were happening overseas outside of the US actually come into the US now, and we've seen things such as the Romanian Roll. I don't know if you're familiar with that, but it's honestly like something straight out of Fast and Furious, where the load is moving down the road at high speeds and they're actually pilfering it and unloading the cargo while in motion and taking things out of the back of the trailer. So that's just an example of some of the methods that we've seen that have started to become more frequent in the US, where we had typically seen them overseas.
Wow, that is absolutely insane. There was another thing, and I don't know if this is happening yet in the United States, but there was another thing that he had mentioned that for in Brazil, they almost try to recruit high schoolers to, just get into with the cartels and the local gangs within Brazil, and then they recruit them to start working at different logistics companies. And so then they have an in once that person graduates high school or graduates their schooling and then goes and works for these logistics companies.
Yeah, absolutely. That's not something that we've encountered too much of in the US. But what ties in very closely to that is that people on the inside and carrier companies that are set up and trying to look as reputable as can be, but part of what our FraudWatch solution does is it incorporates, first of all, a very rich historical data set that we have from an intelligence perspective, but then also integrating with third-party data sources such as the FMCSA data, along with a variety of other sources. And so what that helps us identify are those illegitimate carriers, or carriers that are trying to appear as if they're legitimate and they've been working in the industry for a while. And so that's where our FraudWatch, when a carrier is entered into the system as part of the process, is able to flag that, hey, this, after passing through our rules engine, this doesn't meet the criteria that we would expect, and you might want to reconsider shipping that load with this carrier.
That's super interesting. And so it's almost like an alert system prior to maybe it becoming a problem.
Yeah, exactly. And maybe just to even speak a little more to FraudWatch in that context. So a big problem that a lot of our customers had, and that a lot of people still have in the industry, is double brokering, and a shipment being created maybe via their TMS platform, and a certain carrier being assigned, but then who actually shows up on the day to pick up that load. And that's where we have software that's available at the dock that allows them to capture the carrier who's showing up at that time, and then we assess it against who was the originally booked carrier through the TMS, and then compare if that's double brokered, and then at that same time run that through our FraudWatch system to be able to understand, has it been operating for more than 6 months? Is there more than one driver there? Do they have more than one tractor or trailer registered? There's a lot of these different nuances that we've understood through our history, but also through our intelligence teams that work at Overhaul, to really kind of define and make that FraudWatch product very useful and impactful for our customers.
And so when somebody is using FraudWatch, is it almost like they have a screen open on, say like a traditional like broker's office or something? They have four screens, and they're booking loads, they're calling, they're sourcing carriers, they're doing all of that stuff. Do they have FraudWatch as like one of their screens as they're looking at on a day-to-day basis?
So there's actually there's a few different ways that they can use FraudWatch. And so first and foremost, FraudWatch is preventative, and we try not, as I said before, to disrupt their flow of how they do things. So for example, if they want to create shipments in a TMS, then at that time, via an API, we will assess the carrier that they've assigned. So that can be completely hands-off just through their TMS system, and then we can send that as a notification or an alert to whoever at the customer wants to be notified of that, to say that, hey, you've potentially put a risky carrier on this load. So that's kind of hands-off approach. Then we have software that can be loaded onto a tablet, a mobile application, and we're also looking at appless, because who doesn't have app fatigue at this point? And that's where it can be a little more hands-on, where you're capturing at that point of departure who the carrier is, and so that's alerting that to you. But then, as you mentioned, there is also a web app that has the carrier dashboard where you can enter carriers in, and maybe it's not that one-time checkout where you're assessing that particular carrier, but you're uploading multiple carriers and you're getting that bulk check and just assessing your network for any of the latest risks. So
exception management, maybe.
Yeah, exactly. And one thing is that people will talk about AI. Every other second word here is probably going to be AI, but
Yeah.
you're only as good as the data that you have and the intelligence that you have, and that's where on the Overhaul side, something that is very unique to us is 16 years worth of intelligence data from an intelligence team who has worked in this space. We have some former law enforcement with over 80 years between them who are working in tandem with
Oh, that's
FraudWatch.
interesting. Huh. So you actually have officers too that are working for Overhaul.
Yeah, exactly. And so, we really aim to combine machine learning, AI, data, but with subject matter experts as well, to validate, to review. Of course, not every shipment that ever travels is captured in Overhaul, so we do have other integrations, and we do have team members that are focused on understanding, well, what are the latest trends, what do we need to be able to respond to. I can actually give you another example of something that we're seeing and how...
I would love to hear some. That was going to be my next question, is hear some of those latest trends.
Yeah.
Commodities that are targeted, maybe tactics.
So there's been a 50% increase from 2023 to 2024 in cargo theft, and 30% of that has been around electronics. So electronics is heavily targeted. 50% of that has been pilferage, and I think 25% has been full truckload. So we're seeing a big uptick in cargo theft. But to speak to Overhaul, one thing we do also see is that for the goods that are targeted frequently or are maybe more high value, 1 out of every 2,000 loads that aren't monitored by Overhaul will see a theft event. Maybe a attempted pilferage, things like that.
What does that mean? Somebody's trying to steal, like the Romanian Road, that what you were talking
about?
Yeah,
they're just trying to take a couple of boxes off the back,
wow.
Maybe some TV screens, consoles, things like that. Just trying to use the moment, get away with what they can. And so that's 1 in 2,000 that we see targeted that aren't monitored by Overhaul. But then when you are monitored by Overhaul, it's 1 in 35,000. So our preventative measures is what we really focus on, as to don't get yourself into that situation where you're susceptible to cargo theft, or you're driving on a lane or in a region or using a carrier who is going to, potentially put that load at risk. And so that's, super interesting stat, I think, from our side, is that we are, continuously beating that industry trend for those who target high value goods. But sorry, I forgot. I was going to get back to the example. And so one thing that we're seeing, speaking to the sophistication of cargo criminals today, is that they will take the BOL at an origin facility and then get in transit, and they'll actually have printers in the cab with them to doctor the BOL, and then show up at the delivery location, give the receiver the updated BOL, and then leave with the rest of the goods. And so that's where that double brokering and preventative step is so important. And that's the kind of issue that Fraud Watch is tackling. And honestly, that's been growing rapidly.
Wow. What are some other maybe trends that are evolving? Because I have heard, I think it was around 2020 or maybe 2021, that it wasn't necessarily electronics that were being targeted. It was more like perishables. So energy drinks, were I think were a big one. Pistachios were also a big one. Are there any other like commodities maybe? Because for a lot of, I think for the audience, for a lot of those examples, there's no tracking those products because
Yeah.
once they're eaten or used, that you can't find, a VIN number or UPC number on the back
Yeah.
of that versus like an electronic device. So I'm curious if any of those other sort of commodity trends you're seeing in your data.
Yeah, I think one of the recent stories that came up was maybe you saw it around the eggs being stolen.
No.
And so, that kind of speaks to...
Did you say an X-wing stolen?
Sorry, eggs. The
Eggs.
food.
Eggs.
I knew
I
the
thought you had, like,
Irish
Star
accent was
Wars, like-
gonna get me in trouble here. And so we saw recently, and I think it hit pretty much mainstream news as well around eggs being stolen, and that speaks to how agile a lot of these cargo criminals are, because it's not necessarily about the value of the goods, it's also about demand. And so, eggs is something that's been very topical over this last while, and so they know, and a lot of these cargo criminals are also wholesalers, the good ones, and so to them it's about margin and how quickly you can shift that. And so sometimes when you see something like demand for eggs and you know that there's market there for it, that's actually can be more incentive than going and taking TVs, because they know that they can just move that so quickly.
And once it's gone, it's gone.
Yeah,
There's no
absolutely.
traceability to it.
Mm-hmm.
What other trends, I guess, are you seeing for maybe 2025 and beyond?
I really just do think that it's the continued sophistication of how these cargo criminals are operating. I think that example that I gave of the updated BOL shows that they're much more familiar with what's happening in terms of how people are monitoring goods and how they're responding to it. And so that's, a constant evolution on our side, is how can we stay ahead of that? We can bring out the latest technology and then we might see them respond, and so we got to keep being ahead of it. And from my perspective, Overhaul being device agnostic and being able to leverage the variety of different IoT sources across many of the manufacturers, gives us that advantage, because we're not tied into a specific type of device. We've introduced new things this year, such as the Bluetooth seal, where it's a seal that's on the back of the trailer, and when it's cut, it communicates with the device that's inside to let them understand that this has now been targeted and it's a definite, this door has been opened. So our flexibility there from a data point of view. Then there's door switches that can be installed for when the door opens, and a lot of different solutions and configurations like that. And it's that configurability that I think resonates most with our customers, is that we're able to respond, and be very agile to these challenges that occur as criminals get more sophisticated.
Is there a recommended tech stack for somebody to avoid fraud in particular? Like you mentioned the Bluetooth device, maybe the door sensors. What would, if you were starting a trucking company and you were worried about your freight, how would you secure it?
It's a great question. And it honestly comes down to the use case. Are you multimodal? Are you using rail? Are you shipping overseas or air, vessel? Because there's a lot of different intelligence that we can pull into those, container tracking or master airway bill tracking, to understand if the route is changing dynamically, and make sure, because that's one of the most important things, is how accurate is the data from A to B, and are you able to define, the lanes and the risks that might be occurring there. But, maybe just to try and answer your question, I do think incorporating a Bluetooth seal or a door switch, depending on how you're going to be shipping, those are the solutions today that I think are the most effective to combating it. And having multiple integrations and data sources. So, for example, what we'll always strive for as a device and IoT agnostic company is, can we integrate the ELD or the telematics that are going to be on the tractor trailer? Can we combine that with an IoT source? So, for example, if a trailer got separated or if cargo got separated, you're understanding that separation because we have multiple data points in real time on that shipment. So, yes, there are configurations that I think are the best in class with seal and door switches, But then I also think just continuing to push and incorporating more of what's already out there into Overhaul, and then we can detect any separations or anomalies that occur.
Outside of just sort of, I guess the IoT devices or, the fraud watch, is there any like sort of just base level things that companies can do to try to avoid their risk profile?
Yeah, I think going to the preventative measure, and that's where we've really been focusing more of our attention on the last couple of years, because I think we've done a fantastic job for the in-transit A to B once it's left. We've got extensive law enforcement network to back us up there, but it's really about being more preventative. So, working with us to look at your carrier network, look at the lanes and regions, seeing what's the theft profile for those lanes. Are you an electronics customer who's operating on a lane or region that has seen a growth in electronics theft? So that's the base level thing, is just getting ahead of it, and what we've termed shifting left back into the network, the lanes, the regions, and just as you're setting up for maybe Q3, Q4 launches of new products or things that will be targeted, it's just doing that work ahead of time to ensure you're as safe, secure as you can be. But nothing is perfect. There's always ways it can happen. So, but I do feel the preventative measures are what's really important.
So say you're a company and you've done the hard work of you've got the preventative measures in place. You've got fraud watch. What happens if it still gets stolen? What happens if there's still an issue? Does Overhaul play a role in that? And
yeah, and look, obviously, you don't want to see that happen, but of course it does happen, and that's where I think that we've excelled is in response. I think it's a 96% recovery rate
wow.
when something does get stolen, and we have extremely detailed, extensive networks globally with law enforcement. I think there was a theft in Poland on a rail shipment, and we had boots on the ground, law enforcement there within 20 minutes. I think it was just over 10 minutes. And this was in the middle of nowhere, really out there. And that just speaks to kind of how extensive that network is. And so to answer your question, what we would typically see is an event that occurs in the system. So, maybe the IoT sources come off route, or it's deviated from the delivery location that it's been moving towards, or perhaps we see a sensor event like that seal open or door switch, things like that. And so what we would do at that point is, once the event is generated, it goes in front of our security operators team. So we kind of have two stages. We get a lot of raw data into our system. We have over 7 billion data points now of that raw in-transit risk monitoring data. That gets assessed by the Overhaul rules engine. Once something is triggered there, that gets routed to the appropriate personnel. So if it's something like a seal break, that might go direct to the intelligence team. They'll kick off their response with law enforcement and say, hey, we know that something bad happened here, get law enforcement involved, and then respond. They kick off a session where they'll have the intelligence team member, law enforcement contacts there, and they'll respond and get people on the ground to recover that or track that. And it's really interesting. You see some high-speed chases, and it's pretty intense of lot. It really, like I said, going back to Fast and Furious, it's not too far off the.
When something like that happens, what does your company look like? Is it like a war room where everybody is on the phone and checking systems and?
Yeah, we've got the process down and procedure, so it's not like something where it's an all hands on deck. We've got the appropriate people who are working, to respond and resolve these events. So it's pretty like clockwork, procedural. Things happen. It goes through that process of getting the right person in touch, monitoring, responding to the event. So it's really, obviously I'm on the technology side and product side, and I love what we've been able to do, but I'm always in awe of the law enforcement guys and how they've kind of built that network and communicate. It's just super efficient.
Yeah, it's just, I think it's absolutely crazy that, this, not crazy, because I think fraud and just sort of cargo theft has always existed since, the dawn of man.
Yeah.
But how it has evolved over even just the last handful of years, and how it continues to evolve, and it's just this constant game of like criminals trying to, one up the tech providers like yourself and the risk providers or risk protection like Overhaul, and so it's an interesting like cat and mouse game that just continues to evolve. Last couple questions here. Is there anything important that you think you should mention that we haven't already talked about?
I think also you touched on the fundraising there, and we're continuing to invest in our AI solutions as well, and our machine learning and data capabilities. We completed an acquisition a couple of years ago that basically doubled the amount of in-transit security events that we had in our system, and it actually was very well timed with Gen AI and the emergence of that as a technology that people wanted to leverage, because it made us centralize our data repository where, as part of acquiring that company and bringing in that data set, we knew we would need a more refined and robust data infrastructure and architecture. And so what that meant is that we have all this data that basically everything that's in the Overhaul ecosystem lives there. And then when GPT came about, it meant that we could easily pass that data back and forth. So while people are talking about AI and how it can affect business, it really depends on how good that data set is and how rich it is. And so we were very fortunate that we went through all of that effort to centralize it just as GPT emerged, and now we're able to pass that back and forth. So I do want to call out that today GPT is the worst it'll ever be, or Gen AI is the worst. So it's important to incorporate that as much as you can into the functionality and products that we're building, because then we'll grow as that continues to develop. And then just on the the funding also, continuing to look at M&A as referring to that previous acquisition, that helped us bolster the security perspective and the data set we had there. And so we're always looking to expand and grow into adjacent markets and improve our visibility and the data that we have. So that will be something for this year as well, as we continue to assess what's out there and how it can bring more value to what we do today.
I imagine that data migration project was killer.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, that was.
How long did it take?
So we actually had a 6-month timeline on it, so it was
that
very
feels quick,
hands
though.
on deck. Yeah, but that on the infrastructure side, that's one of the areas that I'm most proud of. Got a fantastic team there that was able to get that done while also competing projects that you go through as an acquisition anyway. So the timeline was aggressive, but yeah, we've got a great team, thankfully.
That's awesome. 6 months. That's very admirable, because I'm thinking of like all these different data sets that you have in order to rework, I guess, the architecture and then migrate all of those into that new architecture and have it talk to an LLM. Like, that is a major undertaking.
Yeah.
So kudos to you. I'm sure it was a nice vacation at the end of that 6 months.
Still waiting on it.
Well, I guess that's sort of the nature of the beast when it comes to fraud prevention and risk assessment and things like that in this industry. It's constantly evolving.
Yeah, exactly. And it's the data, and it's incorporating, in my opinion, humans into that to enrich and refine and create that loop where the system is assessing the raw data, but then you have that enrichment when it gets to that law enforcement escalation. You have somebody that's then labeling it, tagging it, and it's going back into the system, and it's continually improving and making our solution more intelligent.
That's a hell of a way to end it. So that's a perfect ending for us. So Jonathan, where can folks follow you, follow your work, get a demo with Overhaul, all that good stuff?
Yeah, I think over-haul.com. That's our marketing site. That's the best place to go. And then you can also follow us on LinkedIn.
Awesome, Jonathan.
Pleasure. Thank you very much.
Thank you.